Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, it's my pleasure to host this session a session where we're speaking with a distinguished guest within our series, Conversations in Islamic Ethics. So the guest who I have with me today is Professor Cyrus Ali Zargar, who is Al-Ghazali Distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Central Florida. So welcome, Cyrus. Very grateful for you to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, so our aim today is to speak a little bit about one of your books, your most recent book, although it's been a few years, I think, since it was published. The book is, The Polished Mirror, full title, Storytelling and the Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism. The book was published in 2017 by One World Press. And hopefully, Cyrus is going to help us understand a little bit about the book and its place within Islamic ethical thinking more generally. So before we get into some of the details of the book, one of the things which strikes us, of course, we can't deny that however we engage with Islam is deeply ethical or deeply concerned with ethics, whether it's at the level of belief, whether it's at the level of practice, from a scholarly perspective or from a, practicing individual's perspective. I think ethics, at least for me anyway, ethics is something which is very difficult to take out of consideration when it comes to Islam. And in terms of scholarly engagement with ethics in Islam or Islamic ethics, we could take a variety of approaches. So some might choose to focus on a scriptural engagement with questions regarding ethics. Others might try to focus on looking at ethical questions or ethical practice in terms of the jurisprudential traditions within Islam, fiqh, legal theory, usul al-fiqh, so on and so forth. Others might try and take a more theological lens, with kalam and so on and so forth. In your work, as kind of the title says, you've engaged with philosophy and Sufism, or as I'm, more specifically, I guess it might be fair to say falsafa and tasawwuf. So can you say something a little bit about why you think falsafa and tasawwuf are important for understanding Islamic ethics or ethics in Islam?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me address first the really, I think, astute point that you brought up right at the outset, which is that Islam is a heavily ethical tradition. In that regard, it's similar to the other Western religions, Christianity and Judaism. It also has some distinguishing sort of particularities that make it that make it interesting. And I think if you look at the course of Islamic intellectual history and you imagine each of the different facets and approaches to ethics that exist within what we could call Islam, if you can imagine them as a person sort of juggling, right? It's a lot to juggle. You have the legal tradition, the theological tradition, the Quranic tradition, hadith. You have the akhlaq writings. You have tasawwuf, which links to the akhlaq writings, but expands on it, maqamat and the ahwal and other discussions of all that. You have storytelling and wisdom literature. You have all of these, shall we say, balls in the air, these things that you're juggling. And I think the danger for any particular scholar has traditionally been that there is too much. There is so much that a person, just for the sake of becoming a specialist, might focus on one. And if one branch seems to become more prominent than others, there is also that danger of Islam seeming to be or being reduced to one of these things to the exclusion of the others, right? And this is what Abu Hamid Ghazali deals with, right? He's dealing with what he perceives to be among the scholars, among the ulama, an excessive fixation, preoccupation with fiqh and the externalities of the Islamic tradition. And he sees the remedy for that, in the very things that I focused on in this book, which are, on one hand, the akhlaq tradition within which the philosophers were interested in, perhaps more than others as a science, but also tasawwuf, which links to that. He sees that as a kind of remedy. But I think you have to be careful to say that he sees it as a replacement, which I think a lot of contemporary people would do. Oh, here is the answer to our problems. Fiqh is not useful for me. This is useful for, let's say, Abu Hamid Ghazali, also for Faith Kashani, who picks up, he sees, 5 centuries later, he sees his society in Safavid Iran being very similar to that one. Similar dilemma, similar conclusion, right? He sees this as a remedy, but not that one should necessarily replace the other. And so in that sense, to now answer the second part of your question, which is why.
So before we go to the second question.
Yeah, sure.
Just for the sake of our audience.
Yeah.
When you mention Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, I guess you're talking about the approach which kind of epitomizes Ihya Ulum ad-Din,
right?
Revival of the Islamic sciences.
Right.
So this giant Sunni scholar, and the Faith Kashani, his Muhajjat al-Bayda, which is kind of a summary of that. So you're saying that here you're seeing in these works kind of an approach which is bringing together that akhlaq traditions of falsafa and tasawwuf as a remedy to an overemphasis of fiqh, or?
Well, that's one problem, yeah. And it's not just an overemphasis of fiqh. I mean, for Abu Hamid Ghazali, it's the way the fuqaha are even thinking about morality.
Okay.
The overemphasis for him, you see, the way Abu Hamid Ghazali looks at his society is actually very, very mature intellectually, because he sees, in much of the same way that Noam Chomsky describes it, that when the intellectual class, sort of, their ideas have a profound effect on those who listen to them. And so if you want to change the conversation, you change the conversation among the intellectuals, right? So he sees that, and he sees the shortcomings in thinking about Islam from this lens of fiqh exclusively, right? And the inability of fiqh to answer sort of very basic questions, the lack of concern with, really someone's hereafter, right? It's not a shortcoming of the science. I mean, in fact, the science has progressed, and it has become a science because it could focus on certain things. But what I'm saying is that Islam itself has all of these different, just as you said, all of these different facets, ethical facets, that if you focus on one and forget the others, you sometimes need to be reminded about the others. And I mean, in that way, that's what made me interested in ethics, which I'm calling virtue ethics, Islamic virtue ethics, from the perspective of philosophy and tasawwuf, which is that in my case, the scholars who seemed to be neglecting it, at least from the way I was discussing it, were scholars of Islamic studies, right? It's not that there was nothing out there, but that, let's say, in this great juggling act, this had been sort of set aside, or when it was discussed. If you read a lot of the writings on Islamic virtue ethics, I mean, they were very limited. It was almost as if people's hands were tied, and you could only talk about something as virtue ethics if the author used the word akhlaq, or tahdhib al-akhlaq, or something like that in it. So it was like, okay, so let's talk about Miskawayh. But the problem they were facing is, okay, Miskawayh, he's not. What will you really say? I mean, it's a very syncretic approach to bringing together sort of philosophical writings, Aristotelian things, other things that he's reading. He brings it together. It's not that original, So what's there to say about it? But once you start to look at virtue ethics more broadly as the perfection of human character in the Islamic sciences, in falsafa and tasawwuf, as a way of getting to a point where you can mirror divine qualities, it becomes actually a really fascinating branch of Islamic ethics, and one that's really worthy of attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, so thank you for that contextualization.
Sure.
So yeah. As you've kind of pointed out, the book, or as we said, the full title of the book emphasizes that your focus is, as you've just led us to, looking at virtue ethics okay, in these two traditions, okay, and overlapping traditions, as you so neatly and consistently point out.
Mhm.
So, do you want to say something a little bit to kind of ramp us back in about how you position virtue ethics, as being more general than actually philosophical ethics, or the the treatment, as you pointed out just now, that is associated with the likes with that Greek tradition, which we saw, kind of the conduit being Miskaway and others, but also how we can see, the work of people in tasawwuf as a form of virtue ethics. So what do you mean by virtue ethics? How is that applied to both the akhlaq traditions and the traditions of tasawwuf?
So there's a way of looking at virtue ethics, strictly speaking, in the mold of Western philosophy, that it's very Aristotelian. It's very interested in defining certain virtues and thinking through them morally. Now, one problem that you face immediately when you begin to think about ethics in an Islamic context, as opposed to this context that's trying to answer questions, let's say, about medical issues, the well-being of a patient, or the administration of a city or something like that, is that the Islamic context, as we've been saying, is a bit different. Muslim thinkers have the Sharia, most of them, and in a sense that frees them from having to think about virtue while also thinking about this kind of these normative issues of, how do we treat the patient? How do we administer a city? How do we do we eat ethically? It frees them to make this, to make the perfection of human character something that you can focus on as just that, right? So you have your basic normative laws of society in the Sharia. Great. Let the fuqaha deal with that, or we can talk about that. But when it comes to the higher progression, of doing things that aren't just required or even recommended, but modeling yourself on some ideal, human model, thinking about yourself as traversing to some goal, right? You're free to think about ethics much more as a particular field of study. So let me, that was kind of convoluted. Let me specify what I'm saying here. So I mentioned that when it came to akhlaq, there was an overemphasis on thinking about, strictly speaking, akhlaq writings, like the writings of Miskaway. Yahya bin Adi has a treatise on ethics, and there are a number of akhlaq texts. There's sections of the Ihya Ulumuddin of Ghazali that are on akhlaq, and there's a lot of akhlaq texts. Nasiruddin Tusi, obviously, there's some very famous ones. But what do you do about the fact that many Sufi treatises, including Khaja Abdullah Ansari's treatise Manazil al-Sa'irin, include akhlaq as one stage of the journey to human perfection? What do you do about that? There is there are treatises, Sufi treatises, a number of them, that will talk about akhlaq, but then they'll say, okay, moving beyond akhlaq, moving beyond the tahdhib al-akhlaq, the cultivation of the fada'il, the virtuous character traits, moving beyond just that, these are the stages after that. What do you do? Do you say, well, that's separate, that's Sufism, this has nothing to do with that? Clearly it does. They're borrowing from those texts, they're alluding to those texts, they're using the same vocabulary as those texts, but they're saying there's more to it. Okay? The fact of the matter is, each of them is reading the other. What do you do about the fact that Ibn Sina, right, when he wants to talk about the arif, and he wants to talk about the ethical perfection, floods his writing with terminology from the Sufi sciences. Now, here's someone who, when he writes about akhlaq, generally does so from the akhlaq tradition. So what do you do about the fact that he also draws from the Sufi tradition? Clearly, what had developed were these let's say, sciences of human perfection that were actually borrowing from one another, that were actually seen as, parallel, having common goals, having sometimes common vocabulary, even if the end wasn't the same, even if the let's say the personal philosophy of that thinker might have been different, that's fine. But they had a common interest and were borrowing from each other and reading one another. So how do you describe that in English? Do you say, perfection of character? Do you say the spiritual arts? Well, no, because you can compare it to the study of virtue, to the study of virtue and virtue ethics in the Aristotelian tradition and the Western tradition. It has a lot of commonalities there. You can compare it, and that's what I do in the book.
Yeah, very nice.
Thank you.
So, again, at a very simple level, both are, at least from what I've understood, both are concerned with the agent. Both traditions are deeply concerned, with an agent-focused approach to ethics. And I think you really nicely demonstrate how these are overlapping, engaging with each other, and I guess also pushing back against each other rather than just complementary. So,
thank you.
Brilliant. Right. So, you've mentioned. So we've talked about falsafa. We've talked about tasawwuf. How you set this frame, overarching frame of virtue ethics. That these are two traditions which have coexisted, or as the earlier kind of image that you're given, these are two balls which are being juggled together, if you like.
And obviously sometimes crisscross, right? Ibn Tufayl is someone who was both a Sufi and a philosopher, and then you have, a number of. I mentioned Ibn Sina's crossing over of, but there's all kinds of interconnections and borrowings. What do you do with, Sohrawardi? What do you do with, Ibn Arabi and the school of Ibn Arabi? There's all kinds of crossovers between these two intellectual traditions when it comes to a number of issues, not just ethics, but metaphysics too. But yeah, in terms of ethics, there is that crossover. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, brilliant. Yeah, excellent. So, so the crossover. So virtue ethics helps with kind of bringing together, allowing us to engage with these crossovers, and this complexity and diversity, right? So I think I have, unequivocally to me, that's one of the strengths of the work, and a really dynamic approach. But one of the other key things that then we're still on the title, is the aspect of storytelling.
Right.
So what does storytelling do here to help bring these traditions together, at least in your story? And how is it useful to have used storytelling, as a way into, these diverse ethical insights, theories, and practices of Muslim thinkers across the Akhlaq tradition and the traditions of Tasawwuf?
That's a great question. I'm currently teaching a class in religious studies, and we've just gotten to what's called the case method. What the case method does is it takes students and it puts them in real scenarios of things that have happened in real life and asks them, well, what would you do? Right? So let's say, for example, one of these cases is, this is Diana Eck, her pluralism project. This is, I'm answering your question. I just want to mention.
No.
Okay. Yeah, don't think I'm not trying to, trying to get out of it. So, what do you do if there's this is one of the cases that there was a Christmas tree display. This is a real thing that happened. There was I think at the Seattle airport, there was a Christmas tree display, and there was a rabbi who noticed that, and he requested that a menorah be put up as well for inclusivity. So what did the airport do? They took down the Christmas tree. Now the rabbi, that's not what he wanted. He wanted it to be inclusive, but actually, what they were doing as a kind of precaution is, let's avoid the topic altogether. So we think about this and we talk about this. Now we can talk about theory all we want, but you notice right away as a human being, when you're put into a context, what you're forced to deal with is a plurality of perspectives, the complexity of human life. You're forced to deal with the fact that really it's not about one person being right or wrong, but about varying perspectives on benefit and how a person what a person wants out of the situation. It's true to life. And so when a person, let's say, takes theory and applies it there, or even learns theory from stories, it's very different. And that's why traditionally Muslim scholars have used storytelling when it came to ethics. And it's not just in Islam, it's in the world's traditions more broadly, right? Because within the context of the story, things aren't simple. And that's what we know about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, it's not some like what, Kantian, like this is the answer, right? This is what you always do. What you always do doesn't work in real life. In real life, you're dealing with all kinds of exceptions and issues and problems. And so putting a person within the framework of a story makes them think about those perspectives. Now, I try to do that throughout the book, but where I really try to do it is when I can consider a longer story, a longer narrative, which is the one from Rumi, which is in chapter 10. That's where that is an actual case study. It's a case study of thinking about virtue ethics in the context of the story of the Sufi and the judge, right? And what you begin to realize is, I won't bother you with the story unless you want me to, but what you begin to realize is that it's...
Well, maybe it would be good to just give us, if you could give a brief account of the story.
Happy to.
For those listeners who haven't read the book yet, my hope is that we're going to entice people to read this book, So
this is from Rumi's Masnavi. I'll make it quick. This is from Rumi's Masnavi, and the story is that there's a man who's very sick. The doctor comes to his house, as was how it was done back then, and sees this patient, and he comes to the conclusion that this man's going to die. He's that sick. He's very weak and sick. So he feels for him, and he doesn't want to tell him that he's going to die. So instead, what he says, listen, you do whatever you want. Whatever makes you feel good, that's what cures you, because he wants him to enjoy his last days on earth. Now, this man takes the prescription very literally and thinks that he needs to act on any impulse that comes to him. So he's walking along the waterfront and he sees a Sufi who's making wudu. And he has this impulse to slap him. So he does. He slaps the Sufi. The Sufi is very upset, drags him to the judge, the Qadi. And this is where this is the climax of the story, and the most important part is, what will the judge decide? It's a clear-cut case for the Sufi. The Sufi wants the full, he wants the Kantian universal. He wants the law. He wants, this is my right, and this is what you have to do to him. You have to beat him, But what you realize is that the judge looks at the situation of this man. This man is weak, sick, and very poor. And he really wants to forgive him, but because the Sufi insists, he asks for just a little bit, a small recompense thing to be paid to the Sufi. And then when the sick man sees that it's so cheap, he slaps the judge, right? So it's set up almost like a joke. And it's a story, but as you get into it, what you realize is that Rumi is able to look at each perspective of each individual and show you how, listen, it's not about right and wrong. It's about a particular situation that you're in, and what is the most noble action that you can take? What is the most noble perspective that you can have, considering the perspective, where you are. Right? It's a lovely story, and it's a great case of the way this virtue ethics has worked traditionally in Islamic writings. You could call this a Sufi. Rumi's Masnavi is a Sufi literature. Sure, if you want to call it that, you can. But Rumi was, as you know, he was an accomplished faqih himself. He was. He knew his theology, he knew his Quran. All of these things come into the story as well. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at in the book with the narrativity and with the narrative, is that it's perhaps one of the finest examples of this shared tradition. And you'll see storytelling, by the way, practiced by philosophers, Sufis, and others. It's another shared practice, right?
Yeah, brilliant. So I think it really works for kind of a number of levels. So the continuity that it gives as a shared practice between the philosophers and those scholars of tasawwuf that you look at. Your point here about it being a form of of helping us consider ethical issues at the level of application, rather than just a theory. And I think that's a good pushback, because sometimes people think that these discourses of akhlaq and tasawwuf, they deal with more theoretical ethics. And again, it's fiqh which deals with applied ethics.
Right.
But I think these stories, especially how you've just positioned it now, remind us, actually, and this shows us the difficulties and the nuance involved when it comes with the application of theory. So the other thing I wanted to ask you actually on the storytelling, and something which struck me, especially when I was reading some of the stories in the first half of the book, was, 2 points really. First one being that actually sometimes people question, why don't we have at least a rampant or why don't we find, an elaborate discourse or tradition of science fiction, amongst Muslim scholars.
Yeah.
Right? And do you think this type of storytelling plays a similar role, that is there to evoke questions, consideration, and, what do you think about it as a genre? As opposed, does it play some sort of role? Like we see contemporary science fiction helps people think about moral dilemmas.
100%.
And, if the question is clear.
It's completely clear, because you know what? I actually thought about this question with the Ibn Tufayl chapter. So I would consider the story of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan to be science fiction. Okay? Because if you think about it, right? What is the story of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan? What he's really saying is that, would it be possible for a lump of clay embedded in the earth with just the right composition, at just the right temperature, with just the right light from the sun shining down upon it, would it be possible for a human being to be spontaneously generated? And this is something that the classics people thought about. And I mean, spontaneous generation is something that we've moved away from scientifically, but if we're talking about science fiction, we have to be talking about science then. And if that human being were spawned spontaneously on an island where there were no other human beings and no predators that somehow endangered human life, if that person were born on an island, would it be possible for that person to arrive at the most profound conclusions of revelation on their own using reason? That is a science fiction narrative, right? I don't think, and in fact, we can almost say for sure that Ibn Tufayl isn't saying that this happened historically, right? But it's the what if question. It's the thought experiment scenario that science fiction gives us that allows us to play with ideas, right? And the question here in this science fiction narrative is, to what degree can just reasoning about the things around us, observing animals, plants, the heavens, and thinking deeply about them, to what extent can it give us what religion does, what revelation does? And his conclusion in the story, of course, is that a lot, right? It can pretty much give you everything. Now, it's important. The caveat here is that most people are not a Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. He's a person of incredible intellectual gifts that he can arrive at these conclusions. He's the manifestation of Ibn Sina's idea of hads, of being able to intuitively arrive at universals and these kinds of things. It's fine, but it is science fiction, and there's also time travel narratives in pre-modern Arabic literature, and so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think science fiction does play a part.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the follow-on from that is, this type of genre of storytelling, which plays a similar role to the science fiction, at least in kind of understanding or thinking about, where can we be, what can we achieve, what are these ideals, and in the case of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, how much can the individual through his unaided reason achieve potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, from what I took from from your analysis, there's also lots of social commentary going on in these stories.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, and you've just pointed to that, because the reality is a society is multi-layered. And if you like, as some others have described these traditions of philosophy and Sufism as deeply hierarchical. You want to say something about that, the social commentary which is going on here? And the tensions that might rise.
I mean, I know we probably want to talk about the book, but I'm so interested in the science fiction question.
Okay, good.
Don't mind. I just want to, if it's okay with you. So there is a connection between social, where a society is, how it sees itself in science fiction, right? And that is, okay, you think about the 80s in the United States of America and the kind of hope that people had for science. Nowhere is it more apparent, I think, than in Back to the Future 2, something that I saw as a child. And the 1985, the vision of something in, let's say, I think would be the late 80s at this point, of what 2015 would look like, which looks nothing like what 2015 looked like. I mean, really, it was quite a disappointment if you were expecting flying cars and all that. But what does it tell you? Well, it tells you this is how we see ourselves. This is how we define ourselves and our values, right? And we imagine ourselves in, however, in let's say 30 years, we imagine ourselves to be, to have flying cars, to be using fusion to power them, to really progress like that. We believe in science and in ourselves that much. But if you look at science fiction made today, you'll see the tone has shifted such that a lot of science fiction, there's a lot of, I don't think if, for example, Star Trek were created today, it would have such a hopeful vision of the future. I mean, most of it's a lot of dystopian themes. People have kind of lost their hope. If you look at Islamic literature, I think it's a beautiful window, especially pre-modern classical Islamic literature. It's a beautiful window into the way Muslims saw themselves. And if you don't mind, am I going on too long? I just want to say.
Oh, no, this is great, please.
I once had the opportunity to see the Christian theologian Stanley Hauerwas speak. And he's someone whose work I've admired. He's very, very sharp and has a lot of intelligent things to say. But there was something that he said that it struck me as surprising. The issue of rights, human rights, came up. He said, "Yeah, but Islam," and I paraphrase, but he said Islam doesn't really take an interest in human rights. And then the conversation moved on, and I was just in the audience, so I didn't interrupt. But I started to think, could anything more, polar opposite to reality ever have been uttered by someone than to say that Islam is not interested in human rights? Islam is almost obsessed from its first few centuries with rights and dues and judges and courts. It's a religion that's founded on a shahada, right? On a witnessing and a testimony. And above and beyond that, here's an example of showing the way Muslims saw themselves. It's a story that comes up in this book, but I wasn't able to talk about it that much because it didn't fit the scope. Qalila wa Dimna. Now, if you know Qalila wa Dimna, you know that the beautiful trajectory of how this Sanskrit work ends up being translated, from Pahlavi Persian, Middle Persian by Ibn al-Muqaffa to Arabic, and it becomes this very celebrated text where all kinds of people of letters are. I mean, it's beautiful Arabic prose, but
still used to teach Arabic, yeah.
Yeah, so this, right? You know this text, and the structure fascinates people. The frame structure, it ends up becoming, Attar uses it, Rumi uses it, and then through the translations of Ibn al-Muqaffa's version and I think there's another version of it too, but it finds its way through Europe, the Decameron, and then Chaucer's Canterbury Tales too. I mean, the impact it has on world literature. But what did Muslims in Ibn al-Muqaffa, what did he translate, this early translator author, what did he add to this translation? Well, as you know, Dimna, his lies lead to the death of the bull. And in the original story, that's it. The bull's killed, the lion kills the bull, and story. But what does he adds a court scene. Dimna has to be tried. He has to be tried for his crime. So you see, early on, there's this interest in justice, but not just any kind of justice, the justice of the courts, a method of administering justice right there. And you see it again in the story of the Qadi that I told you. It's not that those courts worked like, let's say, American or British courts. No, but, and it worked for that society in that way. But you see the value of rights and dues and courts in the storytelling process when you read the story. So
so in a sense, this almost brings us full circle, is we started talking about falsafa and tasawwuf, not in opposition to fiqh, but as balls being juggled together alongside diverse traditions, as you've put it, have been kind of held together and alongside of each other, and these concerns being mutual, reinforcing, and actually motivating and stimulating some of the rich picture that you've shared with us, right? So I'm going to kind of move to we've got a few minutes left, but I'm going to move the conversation on a little bit, actually. And I think you've picked up a lot of the things which I wanted to kind of push you on and preempted. So one of the things that I liked very much about the book, is, and we've spoken about it already, is this bridging, of disciplines and discourses.
Right.
So, again, in some ways, you could position my own research interests as Islamic ethics, but it's working at the intersection between, if you like, theology and legal theory.
Right.
Yeah, but typically, if you want to study kalam, is distinct from usul al-fiqh.
Right.
Yeah, and we've got some major problems in the academic study of Islam, and arguably even in seminary training, that disciplines are treated separately. So I think you do a great job here, and you've been talking about, the importance of kind of bridging these boundaries in our intellectual endeavors, because the reality of scholarship in the past and the reality of life has been that the concerns of these scholars and of these questions are so intertwined, right? So you've talked about, the bridging of kalam and falsafa, and also its relationship with some of the other Islamic disciplines. But something else that you do really beautifully in the text, and we've done it in this conversation as well, actually, is bring contemporary questions and contemporary discourses into conversation with your analysis of historical texts, right? And you set the book out in that way, talking about this current revival of virtue ethics. So do you want to say something more about that, about the importance and relevance of actually not reducing our study of falsafa and tasawwuf to an exercise in intellectual history? It seems to me that you're not. Your approach isn't one of an intellectual historian purely, and that's something that I very much liked. So hopefully this is a prompt for you to elaborate.
Yeah. Well, I think religious studies is an interdisciplinary field, and well, let me just say I'll answer briefly, and then I'll give it back to you so you can follow up, because let me know if this answers your question. It's a difficult balance between being a specialist and being relevant to a larger public. That was as true in Maulana Rumi's time and in Abu Hamid Ghazali's time as it is today. The authors that we end up reading very often are those who are able to speak to a larger audience. Now, part of that is they do that through storytelling, right? When Abu Hamid Ghazali wants to do it, for example, in the Kimya Sa'adat, he uses many more allegories and stories than he did in the Ihya, because it's more of a specialist audience. But even that is not a text just for specialists. But there are all kinds of texts that the average Islamic studies person might not be interested in or read, because they were written with a specialist audience in mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that in the humanities today either, right? With being a specialist, with being very focused, there's value in that. I think there's different levels of scholarship, and we all play different roles. If I remember, one of Edward Said's critiques was he said he was describing one of these book fairs, where he said basically, you have someone in, let's say, comparative literature who's writing a book that only 6 other people are going to read. And that's true. He was advocating kind of public scholarship, and it is important. The flip side to that is that when you start to make it all about being interdisciplinary and publicly accessible, you lose a lot of the benefits that being a specialist affords you, which is asking very difficult questions. I think the way you keep those two running side by side is either as a scholar, having both roles and maybe multiple outlets of publication, right? So you might publish your difficult things and your specialist things in articles and your more general things in books. That's one thing that a lot of people tend to do. Or the academy itself ends up having people who are generalists and specialists. Both are very valuable. I meant for this book to be for everybody. Now, I hope it is. It wasn't the kind of book, though, that I would have ever had the confidence to write as my first book. Why? Because very often junior scholars who are just starting out, they have to show that they, as they say, have the goods, right? That they can make the argument, that they can read the text, make the argument, know the theory, all of that. That's why you'll often find people who are more advanced in their years and in their scholarship feel freer to write in a way that others can understand, because the questions about their, abilities
have to be less defensive, I guess.
Less defensive, right? Less defensive. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was what came to my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's so. Yeah, you've said it very nicely, and kind of taken us towards relevance. And so maybe we'll kind of move towards, you're wrapping up, just speaking a little bit more about relevance.
Sure.
Because, you make this point, your final section, I think, is titled Relevance rather than Conclusion, for example. And, as you said, that this book, you've written it for a wider audience, and it really, really is accessible. And I think you do more than what you've just described here, even just to introduce people to those who are just interested in falsafa. And those who are just interested in tasawwuf, they would do well to have this, on their reading list. But some of the comments that you make about the relevance at the end of the book, I think are worth us picking up, especially when we were talking about science, and of current science and historical science. Right. And of course, you make this really important comment that the akhlaq traditions, or this philosophical akhlaq, was, of course, and we haven't spoken about it here, but these, this typical picture of the 3 different faculties of the soul, being with a rational soul seeking to bring in check, if you like, the appetitive soul and the irascible soul, or however different scholars have conceived of it. So this, continuous struggle of trying to bring balance within the different faculties of the human soul as being one of the key concerns of the falsafa akhlaq traditions. But you make this really important point that this came out of a picture of of the human sciences of the day, and a particular vision of the humoral sciences and of what the body was composed of. So what does that say about us still relying upon these ideas today? In whether they're Sunni madrasas or they're Shia madrasas, still this akhlaq tradition is still being taught. But those humoral sciences are gone by the wayside. And never mind being taught in the seminaries. I think this discourse actually is informing public at large, actually, through the wider ethical teachings of Muslim scholars. So what do we do with that? And what do you think about that?
Actually, that's a great question. That really is a great question. And I think I have, if not a solution for everyone, a solution that's worked for the way I think about it. Which is that, look, we love pre-modern texts. Many people do. And many people, when they want to find answers, whether about the meaning of life or whatever, they dig into the past. They go into ancient or pre-modern texts. Why? Well, because I think part of it has to do with a realization that, there is something meaningless about modern ways of living that doesn't even try to give us the answers. So if it's not trying to give me the answers, if I'm going to be then let me look into the past. So, but when you look into the past, you do face that problem, and it's the problem that you raised, which is that very often these authors are assuming a worldview that's based on science that we don't accept anymore. And it's part of that is the structure of the human body, the four humors. That's a big part of the akhlaq tradition in treating a person and diagnosing a person, and their the akhlaq tradition uses that quite a bit. But there's more to it than that. There's also astronomy, right? There's a view of the whole cosmos as, these spheres within spheres within spheres, with the fixed stars at the end and the Earth at the center. And, if you really get into it, you'll see that these thinkers will very often tie their theory to that astronomical model. Well, what do you do? Well, first of all, what's important to remember is that very often pre-modern thinkers wanted to have a theory that tied everything together. Mm-hmm. Now, today, we have sort of accepted the fact that you might not have that sort of theory, at least not, until Star Trek time comes along, and at least not for a while, right? We've accepted the fact that there won't be this comprehensive theory. The pre-modern thinkers, the thinkers from these, let's say 12th, 13th centuries that I'm dealing with, this time period that I'm dealing with, they really had this optimistic sense that, astronomy, physiology, all of it can be explained, and ethics tied into that. But once you say, listen, I don't necessarily need everything to tie together that well right now. I don't need my astronomy and my ethics and my physiology to tie together like that right now. And then you begin to look at the akhlaq tradition divorced from the humoral ethics part of it, the moral part of it. What you realize is that the basic structure of that ethics is that a human being is most drawn by two impulses. Three, if you count the rational, but let's focus on the two that you have to worry about. One, associated with the heart, associated with blood, let's forget that for a second, being anger, passion, right? Excessive activity. The other, associated with the liver, but let's forget that for a second, desire, consumption, passivity in terms of not being active. And that the way to deal with them is to balance these two together. Well, that does psychologically describe what we very often face in life. And so there's a way of kind of reading that allegorically and sort of skipping the parts, or not skipping, but at least, setting aside the fact that the humoral part might not work. There are people who still practice, that sort of medicine, and that's fine. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I just know that hasn't been, scientifically tested as right. But there is a way to look at that ethics in that useful way. But then just to remember that the book ends on the Sufi ethics. And it's the Sufis who, amazingly, by being much more interested in the Quran and Hadith tradition and with the sciences of the heart, and less interested in the medical part of the ethics, really you'll be hard pressed to see almost anything they say as being irrelevant in modern times. That's why I put the Sufi part second. I mean, really, I will say this as bluntly as possible. The Sufi version of Islamic virtue ethics, if you want to call it that, is advanced. The second half of this book is more difficult than the first. And it isn't trying to be a theory of everything. It's really only trying to be a theory of the heart. And in that sense, it succeeds and is more successful. It succeeds and is more relevant. And even Ibn Sina, as you know, when he wants to get it to the higher level, he borrows from that science, as I said before. So in that sense, I think as a whole, the Islamic ethics is incredibly relevant, but you just have to read it with the caveat of knowing that this worldview from about 1,000 years ago.
Brilliant. Okay, so typically, we've been talking throughout we use this word at the end, actually, which I think captures, what a lot of the scholars within the book that you've analysed, are trying to emphasise as a key kind of tool in our ethical deliberations and practice, and that's the issue of balance. So not just the balance which these philosophers were trying to bring about within their own faculty, but also in terms of the balance of the way that you've navigated these different discourses. So I really commend the book to everybody who's listening. It has been it's been very, very useful for me. I've used it in my teaching this year and benefited it. Although you're saying it's not for, you've written it for everybody. Somebody who's been involved in Islamic scholarship for a number of years now, deeply interested in Islamic ethics, I learned many, many things. Okay,
I appreciate that.
And that's very, very genuine. So it's just left for me to say thank you, show the book again once more, okay, to all those who are watching and listening. And I very, very much hope that people will take the time to read this excellent work and engage with Professor Zargar's ideas and hopefully benefit from his writing. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And the excellent questions too. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.